A massive, fragile block of fossilized bone glides slowly into the ring of a medical CT scanner. On the monitor nearby, high-contrast digital slices cut through the dense mineral matrix millimeter by millimeter. This is a vertebra from the late Jurassic, roughly 154 million years ago, when colossal animals like Diplodocus walked across semi-arid floodplains. Looking at the sheer scale of their skeletons, our immediate assumption is brute force, solid, heavy pillars of bone supporting tons of muscle. But the scanner reveals the opposite. The bone is hollow, riddled with complex internal struts that once housed a highly efficient network of air sacs. They grew to impossible sizes precisely because they were mostly empty space. It is a biological blueprint that alters everything we know about their endurance. How did the internal architecture of dinosaurs allow one lineage to survive two planetary catastrophes? This is a cross-section of deep time from the Esquigualasto Formation, a sequence of sedimentary rock laid down in what is now the arid badlands of Argentina. Today, the landscape is a stark expanse of wind-sculpted clay and volcanic ash. A place often called the Valley of the Moon. But if we read the rocks carefully, we can map the ancient environment. The fossil soils trapped in these layers tell us that in the late Triassic, about 233 million years ago, this was a seasonal floodplain. It was a volatile, hothouse world. The Earth's landmasses were merged into the supercontinent Pangaea, driving extreme climate swings. Brutal wet seasons alternated with punishing droughts, testing the endurance of every living thing on the continent. We tend to picture the dawn of the dinosaur era as an immediate conquest. We imagine a sudden explosion of dominant, terrifying predators and towering herbivores seizing control of the ecosystem. But the physical evidence beneath our feet tells a very different story. Out in the field, paleontologists do not just look for the most spectacular skeletons. They walk the grid, they map a stratigraphic column, they measure the exact vertical position of every fossil found, building a physical census of a dead world. And this process of logging the fossil ratios reveals a startling constraint on our imagination. In these early late Triassic layers, the bones of dinosaurs are exceedingly rare. For every dinosaur fossil we pull from the Esquigualasto dirt, we find dozens of other animals. The landscape was teeming with cynodonts, stocky, burrowing ancestors of modern mammals, and cruritarsans, heavily armored, quadrupedal reptiles closely related to modern crocodiles. These were the true rulers of the Triassic. They occupied the top of the food chain, monopolizing the roles of apex predators and large-bodied plant eaters. In this crowded, fiercely competitive ecosystem, the earliest dinosaurs were little more than an afterthought. They were a marginal group of small-bodied opportunists, living in the literal and ecological shadows of much larger, more successful reptiles. The jaw slowly emerging from the mudstone under the technician's oar belongs to one of these early pioneers. It is a creature named Eoraptor. The entire animal would have barely reached the knee of a modern human, weighing perhaps as much as a medium-sized dog. To extract it from the badlands, field crews had to dig a wide trench around the fossil, wrap it in layers of burlap and plaster to create a rigid field jacket, and transport it carefully to the lab. Now, with the rock cleared away, we can use calipers to measure the dimensions of the skull and limbs. The long bones of its hind legs are significantly longer than its front limbs, providing direct evidence of a bipedal posture. It walked upright, balancing on two legs. This biomechanical innovation freed its hands for grasping and allowed for rapid, agile movement through the dense underbrush. But it is the skull that offers the most intimate look at its survival strategy. When we place the jaw under a microscope, the magnification reveals a striking detail. The dentition of Eoraptor is mixed. In the front of the jaw, we find recurved, serrated teeth. These are the classic, unmistakable tools of a carnivore, designed for gripping and slicing meat. Yet, sitting directly behind them in the same jawline, the teeth change shape. They become flattened and leaf-shaped, bearing distinct wear facets that are perfectly suited for crushing and grinding tough plant matter. This dental arrangement is a physical record of biological experimentation. Eoraptor was not a specialized apex predator, nor was it a dedicated, massive herbivore. It was an omnivore, catching small insects or lizards when it could, and stripping leaves from low-lying ferns when meat was scarce. It was a generalist, in a highly competitive environment where specialized animals thrive only as long as their specific food source remains abundant. A generalist possesses a hidden advantage. It can adapt its diet to whatever the season provides. SRC01, peer-reviewed paper. 1993. Because these early dinosaurs were so small and relatively rare, our reconstructions of their behavior must be deeply constrained. We sometimes see them depicted in popular culture as highly intelligent pack hunters, cooperating to take down larger prey. But we have no direct evidence in the Triassic rock record to support that. We lack the definitive parallel trackways or clustered bone beds of Eoraptor that would prove complex social hierarchies existed at this stage. That kind of behavior is a speculative reconstruction, an assumption drawn backward from later, more advanced predators. What the evidence actually shows is far more sober. They were solitary survivors. They used their speed and upright posture to snatch a meal and quickly retreat, always careful to avoid catching the attention of the massive crustacean predators that stalked the floodplains. To understand how this dynamic changed, we have to pack up our tools and move vertically. In geology, time is a physical distance. Moving upward through the layers of sedimentary rock is the act of walking forward through millions of years. As we trace the stratigraphic column above the Esquigualasto Formation, reading the deposition of silt and sand that marks the passing of the Late Triassic, we begin to notice a shift in the rock's chemistry and the fossils it holds. The red beds of the deep Triassic begin to give way to different textures. The environmental pressure was tightening. The extreme monsoons and droughts of Pangaea were slowly giving way to something far more violent and unpredictable. As we log the fossil counts in these upper layers, the once dominant crustaceans begin to thin out. The massive armored reptiles that had commanded the floodplains leave fewer and fewer traces in the rock. The ecosystem was destabilizing, reacting to a geological trigger occurring thousands of miles away, deep beneath the Earth's crust. The dinosaurs did not win the Earth through a gradual, evolutionary triumph of superior ferocity. They did not outcompete the ruling reptiles in a fair fight. Instead, as we approach the boundary line that separates the Triassic from the Jurassic, the fossil record reveals a sobering reality. The dinosaurs simply held on while the world around them burned. To understand the exact mechanism of this planetary turnover, we must step away from the physical bones of the animals and look at the microscopic chemistry of the rocks themselves. We have to measure the heat of an ancient apocalypse. A pair of fine, stainless steel tweezers hovers over a glass slide. Under the lens of a polarizing microscope, a single crystal of zircon, no larger than a grain of fine sand, glows with a faint, iridescent hue. This microscopic sliver of mineral is one of the most resilient structures on Earth. It can survive extreme heat, immense pressure, and the slow, grinding erosion of deep time. We are looking at a chemical clock. It is a tiny time capsule forged in the heart of a volcano. As we move up the stratigraphic column, tracking the transition from the late Triassic into the early Jurassic, the rocks change dramatically. Across vast stretches of what is now North America, South America, Europe, and Africa, geologists have mapped thick, dark bands of basalt. These are the solidified remains of ancient lava flows. This massive geological feature is known as the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, or CAMP. As the supercontinent of Pangaea began to tear itself apart, the Earth's crust fractured, fissures opened up, some stretching for hundreds of miles, and poured unimaginable volumes of magma onto the surface. For decades, paleontologists hypothesized that this intense volcanic activity drove the end Triassic mass extinction. It seemed like the obvious killer, the catastrophic event that wiped out the ruling crustaceans and left the world open for the dinosaurs. But proving causality in deep time requires extreme precision. We cannot simply look at a layer of lava, find a layer of dead animals beneath it, and assume they happened on the same day. Geological time is too vast. A million years can look like an inch of rock. We need a mechanism to measure the exact gap between the ash and the bone. We need an absolute date. This is where the zircon crystal under the microscope becomes our most powerful tool. When a volcano erupts, it releases ash. That ash contains trace amounts of uranium, which becomes locked inside the crystalline structure of newly forming zircons. But there is a vital chemical quirk at play. Growing zircon crystals strongly reject lead. When the crystal first cools and hardens, it contains a specific amount of uranium and essentially zero lead. The clock is set. Uranium is unstable. Over millions of years, it decays into lead at a known, constant rate. By taking ash samples from the rock layers directly beneath the camp basalts, crushing the rock, and isolating these individual zircons. Geochemists can read that clock. They load the microscopic crystals into a mass spectrometer. This machine uses a magnetic field to separate and count the exact ratio of uranium isotopes to lead isotopes inside the crystal. Because we know the precise rate of radioactive decay, that ratio gives us a hard, absolute age. High-precision dating of these zircons reveals that the massive camp eruptions began exactly 201.5 million years ago. This date aligns perfectly, within the narrowest margins of geological error, with the sudden disappearance of the Cruratazans in the fossil record. The volcanism and the mass extinction was synchronous. SRCO2, Geochronology Study. 2013. The environmental consequences of the camp eruptions were devastating. The volcanoes didn't just release lava. They pumped billions of tons of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. The planet was thrown into a severe greenhouse state. Global temperatures spiked. The oceans became highly acidic. The atmosphere grew thick with toxic gases. The dense, heavily armored reptiles of the Triassic required massive amounts of energy to move. Struggling to breathe in a compromised atmosphere, their populations simply collapsed. Yet, in the fossil layers immediately above this extinction horizon, we find a stark reversal of the old order. The Cruratazans are gone, but the dinosaurs are thriving. They emerge from the catastrophe as the undisputed survivors. To understand why a lineage of small, marginal generalists survived when the dominant apex predators suffocated, we have to look past the external shape of their bones. We have to peer deep into their internal architecture. In a modern laboratory, a researcher slides a large, fragile fossil vertebra into the scanning ring of a medical CT machine. The monitor illuminates with high-contrast slices. The digital image moves millimeter by millimeter through the dense, fossilized bone of a basal Saurischean dinosaur from the early Jurassic. We cannot dig up a 200-million-year-old lung. Soft tissue decays rapidly, leaving only the hard mineral matrix behind. But bones are not completely solid. They grow and adapt in response to the tissues that surround and press against them. As the CT scan slices through the side of the vertebra, it reveals large, hollow cavities burrowed deep into the bone. These structural depressions are called pleurocols. They are not random erosions. They are not post-mortem breaks in the fossil. They follow a highly organized, complex internal honeycombing pattern. When comparative anatomists overlay these internal structures with the skeletons of modern animals, the match is unmistakable. The internal struts and hollows within these ancient vertebrae are structurally identical to the pneumatized bones of modern birds. This is strong inference, grounded in comparative biology. The presence of these specific cavities strongly suggests that early Saurischean dinosaurs possessed an avian-style respiratory system. They did not breathe like mammals or modern reptiles, where air is pulled into a sac-like lung and then pushed back out the exact same way. Instead, they likely possessed a system of internal air sacs connected to their lungs. This created a highly efficient, unidirectional flow of air. Oxygen-rich air moved continuously through their lungs, both when they inhaled and when they exhaled. SRCO3, Anatomical Analysis. 2009. This internal plumbing was a biological pre-adaptation. The air sacs did not evolve specifically to survive a volcanic apocalypse. They likely evolved earlier in the Triassic as a way to regulate body heat, or to increase aerobic stamina in small, fast-moving bipeds like Eoraptor. But when the camp volcanoes erupted, filling the atmosphere with carbon dioxide and drastically lowering the available oxygen, this highly efficient breathing system became the ultimate survival mechanism. While the heavy, sluggish reptiles of the Old World struggled to extract enough oxygen from the toxic air, the early dinosaurs kept moving. Their upright posture allowed them to cover vast distances efficiently, and their air sacs kept their muscles fueled with a continuous supply of oxygen. They survived not by overpowering their rivals, but by outlasting them. They simply breathed through the end of the world. As the Earth slowly stabilized, entering the long, warm span of the Jurassic period, the continents continued to drift apart. The dinosaurs, having inherited an empty ecological landscape, began to radiate into new forms. And the same internal architecture that had allowed them to survive the suffocating heat of the mass extinction was about to be weaponized for something entirely different. The air sacs were about to allow the dinosaurs to defy the limits of biological engineering. They were about to build giants. A tape measure stretches tightly across the dusty surface of a massive sandstone block. The metallic ribbon unspools, reading just over a meter in length. It is measuring a single neck vertebra. To stand beneath the reconstructed skeleton of Diplodocus is to confront the physical limits of biology. During the Late Jurassic, about 154 million years ago, the Morrison Formation of the American West was a vast, semi-arid floodplain dotted with seasonal rivers and conifer forests. In this environment, the descendants of the small, marginal survivors of the Triassic had scaled up to unimaginable proportions. Diplodocus could reach lengths of nearly 30 meters. It was a living suspension bridge of bone and muscle sweeping across the landscape. When we look at animals of this size, our immediate assumption is that they achieved this mass through brute force. We imagine them eating constantly and growing for centuries, much like a modern crocodile or tortoise slowly adding mass over a long, sluggish lifetime. But deep-time paleontology relies on looking inside the evidence. To understand the explosive growth of the Jurassic giants, we cannot just measure the outside of the bone, we have to cut into it. In a paleohistology lab, a technician uses a diamond-edged saw to slice a section of a sauropod limb bone. The slice is polished down until it is so thin that light can pass directly through the stone. When placed under a polarizing microscope, the internal structure of the bone reveals its growth history. We are looking for lines of arrested growth, similar to the rings of a tree. In slow-growing, cold-blooded reptiles, these lines are tightly packed and numerous. They record decades of slow, seasonal pauses in development, but in the cross-sections of these Jurassic sauropods, the tissue between the lines tells a different story. The bands are wide and highly vascularized, filled with the canals that once housed a dense network of blood vessels. This histological evidence forces a narrowing of our interpretations. The bones tell us that these animals were growing at astonishing, mammal-like rates. A Diplodocus did not take a century to reach its massive size. It likely reached sexual maturity in just a few decades. This requires an immense biological furnace. It implies a metabolic engine burning hot and fast, fueled by processing tons of low-grade vegetation every single day. But how does an animal support the sheer physical weight of a high-speed metabolism running inside a 30-meter body? If a Diplodocus were built with solid bones like a modern elephant, the weight of its own skeleton would shatter its joints and collapse its internal organs. The answer brings us back to the CORT scans and the pleurocols, the hollow cavities we first saw in the early survivors of the Triassic extinction. As the sauropods evolved, that efficient breathing system scaled up with them. The air sacs didn't just stay in the chest cavity. They invaded the postcranial skeleton. The massive vertebrae of Diplodocus are not solid blocks. They are structurally complex frameworks. They consist of thin walls of bone supported by delicate internal struts, enclosing massive volumes of empty space. In life, these spaces were filled with air sacs. The neck of a giant sauropod was essentially a pneumatic tube, reducing the specific gravity of the animal by as much as 10 to 15%. They grew so large precisely because they were mostly air. Yet, knowing how they grew and breathed does not automatically tell us how they lived. Reconstructing the behavior of extinct animals from isolated bones is inherently risky. We can mount a skeleton in a museum, but a skeleton alone cannot tell us if the animal was solitary, or if it lived in complex, structured herds. For that, we need a different kind of evidence. We need to find the ancient ground they walked on. On a sun-baked rock face in what is now Colorado, paleontologists carefully map a series of massive, circular depressions pressed deep into the stone. These are trackways. They are the fossilized footprints of sauropods moving across a muddy plain millions of years ago. By mapping the direction, depth, and spacing of the tracks, we can read a brief moment of behavior frozen in time. At several sites, we find parallel trackways. We see the impressions of multiple individuals, moving in the exact same direction, at the exact same speed. Their paths do not cross. They do not meander. This is strong inference for gregarious behavior. It suggests that these massive animals were moving together as a coordinated unit. However, we must apply strict constraint to this reconstruction. It is tempting to imagine complex, multi-generational herds with dominant leaders and young calves protected in the center, much like modern elephants. But the trackways rarely preserve clear evidence of small, juvenile footprints marching alongside the massive adults. The evidence supports the idea that adult sauropods moved in groups, perhaps migrating to find fresh food or water. But we cannot definitively reconstruct their social hierarchies or parental care from these footprints alone. The tracks tell us they traveled together. They do not tell us how they communicated, or how they organized themselves. As the Jurassic progressed, this rapid, explosive radiation of body plans created a dizzying array of shapes and sizes. Alongside the towering sauropods, heavily armored herbivores like Stegosaurus evolved broad plates and spiked tails. Large, bipedal predators like Allosaurus dominated the apex of the food chain. The simple, omnivorous design of Eoraptor had fractured into hundreds of highly specialized lineages. To make sense of this exploding diversity, paleontologists have spent over a century trying to build a map. They want a family tree that traces every dinosaur back to its common ancestor. But as we discover more fossils and the picture becomes more complex, the very foundation of that map is being called into question. The bones that once neatly divided the dinosaur world are beginning to blur. We are forced to ask if the basic rules we use to classify these animals are actually correct. On a wide laboratory table, two fossilized pelvic assemblies rest side by side. They are heavy, intricate structures of fused bone, stripped of the muscle and cartilage that once powered them. For over a century, these specific bones have served as the fundamental dividing line for the entire dinosaur family tree. In the late 19th century, paleontologists recognized a distinct anatomical divergence. On the left side of the table sits the pelvis of a theropod, a bipedal predator. Its pubic bone points forward and down. It is a shape similar to that of modern reptiles. This group was named the Sauropoda, or lizard-hipped dinosaurs. It included all the meat-eating theropods, like Allosaurus, and all the giant, long-necked sauropods, like Diplodocus. On the right side of the table sits the pelvis of a heavily armored herbivore, Stegosaurus. Here, the pubic bone is swept backward, running parallel to the ischium. This arrangement created a larger abdominal cavity, perfect for housing the massive, fermenting digestive tracts needed to process tough Jurassic vegetation. This group was named the Ornithischia, or bird-hipped dinosaurs. Ironically, despite the name, it was the lizard-hipped Saurischians that would eventually give rise to actual birds. This simple, binary pelvic split became the bedrock of dinosaur taxonomy. Every new species discovered was rooted down one of these two main branches. But reading deep time is rarely that simple. Bones are highly adaptable. Evolution frequently repeats shapes when animals face similar environmental pressures, a process known as convergent evolution. When researchers look past the pelvis and examine the entire skeleton of early dinosaurs, the neat binary division begins to fray. Modern paleontology relies heavily on computational phylogenetics. Rather than grouping animals by a single feature, scientists create massive digital matrices. They score hundreds of individual anatomical traits across dozens of different species. They log the shape of a groove on a femur, the number of teeth in the premaxilla, the exact angle of an ankle joint. A computer algorithm then calculates the most statistically probable evolutionary pathways. Building a cladogram. It is a branching diagram of relationships based on raw anatomical data. In 2017, a major phylogenetic study applied this rigorous, data-driven approach to a massive dataset of early dinosaurs. The algorithm produced a result that disrupted a century of consensus. The computer model suggested that the meat-eating theropods were actually more closely related to the plant-eating ornithischians than they were to the giant sauropods. This proposed new grouping, named the Ornithocelida hypothesis, effectively tore up the traditional family tree and rearranged its deepest roots. SRC04, Phylogenetic Analysis. 2017. This is science operating in a state of active debate. The Ornithocelida model is not universally accepted. Other researchers have since rerun the algorithms with different weighting for specific traits, and their results often revert back to the traditional lizard-hipped and bird-hipped divide. The tension in this debate reveals a fundamental constraint in paleontology. We are trying to reconstruct the messy, continuous flow of biological evolution using only isolated snapshots of hard bone. When lineages diverge, the transitional animals share a confusing mosaic of traits. A slight shift in how a researcher interprets a fractured ankle bone can redraw the evolutionary map for an entire hemisphere. But if the bones are subject to debate, there is another line of evidence that can bypass the skeletal matrix entirely. while the paleontologists in the lab argued over the angles of the pelvis. Field crews working in a completely different part of the world were uncovering a fossil archive that would shatter our understanding of the dinosaur body. They were about to find the soft tissue. We reset our timeline to the early Cretaceous, about 120 million years ago. We are now looking at the Yizhan Formation in Liaoning Province, China. Here, the preservation bias that plagues the fossil record was briefly and spectacularly suspended. Most dinosaurs died on floodplains or in rivers, where their bodies were scavenged, scattered, and ground down by moving sand and gravel, leaving only the hardest bones behind. But the environment of the ancient J-hole biota was different. This region was dominated by deep, anoxic lakes surrounded by active volcanoes. When animals died here, they frequently fell into the still, oxygen-depleted waters at the bottom of the lakes, where scavengers could not reach them. Furthermore, regular volcanic eruptions blanketed the lakes in incredibly fine, powdery ash. This microscopic ash settled over the carcasses like a burial shroud. It sealed them instantly and locked out the bacteria that normally consume soft tissue. The taphonomy of this site, the exact mechanical and chemical process of decay and fossilization, acted as a flawless, high-resolution printing press. A technician uses a micro-abrasive air scribe to clear the final millimeter of ash from a slab of dark shale. As the rock flakes away, it reveals the skeleton of a small, carnivorous theropod. It is named Microraptor, but the bones are not the most important part of this fossil. Surrounding the forelimbs, extending from the tail, and, astonishingly, trailing down the hind legs, the rock preserves the distinct, carbonized impressions of long, asymmetrical structures. These are not the coarse, primitive filaments or fuzzy down we might expect on an early reptile. They have a central shaft with interlocking barbs, creating a flat, aerodynamic surface. They are, undeniably, true flight feathers, and they belong to a dinosaur that is not a bird. SRC05, Paleontological Description. 2003. The discovery of Microraptor and the dozens of other feathered theropods in the J-hole biota forces an absolute macro-reframe of dinosaur biology. For decades, the assumption was that feathers evolved simultaneously with the mechanics of flight. It was seen as a sudden, miraculous adaptation that separated birds from reptiles. But the evidence from China proves that feathers predate flight by millions of years. Many of the feathered dinosaurs found in these ashbeds, such as the large tyrannosauroids, were far too heavy to ever leave the ground. Their feathers were ancestral traits. They likely evolved first as a form of insulation, a dense, fuzzy covering that helped these highly active, warm-blooded predators regulate their body temperature. Later, these structures were co-opted for display, likely used in mating rituals or territorial intimidation, much like the display feathers of modern peacocks. Flight was not the goal of feathers. Evolution has no foresight. Flight was an exaptation, a secondary use of an existing structure. Only later, in small, arboreal theropods like Microraptor, did these display and insulation structures begin to catch the air, allowing the animal to glide from branch to branch. The J-hole fossils provide one more astonishing level of detail. When researchers take tiny samples of these fossilized feathers and place them under a scanning electron microscope, they find microscopic, sausage-shaped structures called melanosomes. By comparing the shape and arrangement of these fossilized pigment packets to those found in the feathers of modern birds, we can infer the actual color of a dinosaur. The melanosomes of Microraptor indicate that its feathers were a deep, iridescent black, similar to a modern crow or raven. We no longer have to rely on speculative reconstruction to paint the ancient world. Through the constraints of chemistry and taphonomy, we are looking at the true, shimmering color of a Cretaceous predator. The dinosaurs had mastered the land. Their internal air sacs had allowed them to build giants, and their insulating feathers had unlocked the aerodynamics of the sky. By the late Cretaceous, they had achieved an equilibrium of breathtaking diversity. But the planetary machine was shifting again. The architecture that made them so successful was about to be tested by a geological event of unparalleled violence. The end was not a slow decline. The end arrived from the sky. We reset the timescale to the very end of the late Cretaceous, about 66 million years ago. We walk along a rocky outcrop in the Hell Creek Formation, a sprawling expanse of badlands in the American West. At this time, North America was split by the Western Interior Seaway, a shallow, warm ocean teeming with marine life. bordered by dense coastal forests and marshlands. This was the domain of the last great dinosaur ecosystems. Scanning the stratigraphy, we see the familiar signs of a vibrant, dominant biosphere. The rock layers are packed with the massive skulls of Triceratops, a heavily armed herbivore built to process immense volumes of vegetation. Just steps away, we find the unmistakable, bone-crushing jaws of Tyrannosaurus rex, the apex predator of its time. The sheer density of fossils indicates a food web functioning at maximum capacity. It was an environment capable of supporting animals with staggering caloric demands. But as we physically trace the rock face upward, something abrupt happens. We reach a distinct, grey layer of clay, no thicker than a human finger. Below this line, the rock is rich with the bones of giants and the pollen of Cretaceous plants. Above this line, the dinosaur fossils vanish completely. It is a sudden, absolute silence in the rock record. For decades, the nature of this disappearance was fiercely debated. Did the dinosaurs slowly succumb to climate change driven by massive volcanic eruptions in India, known as the Deccan Traps? Did the shallow seas recede, destroying their coastal habitats over millions of years? The answer lay hidden inside that thin grey line of clay. In 1980, a team of researchers led by Luis and Walter Alvarez collected samples of this boundary clay from a gorge in Italy. They brought the rock back to the lab and ran it through a mass spectrometer, a machine capable of detecting trace elements at the atomic level. They were not looking for an asteroid. They were looking for a way to measure how fast the clay had been deposited. What the machine output instead was an anomaly that changed the course of science. The spectrometer revealed that the clay was heavily enriched with iridium. Iridium is an incredibly rare element in the Earth's crust. During the formation of the planet, most of it sank deep into the iron core. However, iridium is highly abundant in asteroids and meteorites. The iridium levels in the boundary clay were dozens of times higher than the background levels of the surrounding rock. Crucially, this exact same iridium spike was soon found in the boundary clay at sites all over the world, including right here in Hell Creek. The direct evidence of this global chemical anomaly forced a massive reframe of the extinction mechanism. The primary driver of the dinosaurs' demise was not a slow, terrestrial decline. It was the impact of a massive extraterrestrial body, SRC-06, geochemical synthesis. 2010. The physical proof of this impact goes beyond chemistry. When geologists place samples of the boundary rock under a microscope and apply cross-polarized light, they find grains of quartz that have been structurally fractured by immense, sudden pressure. This shocked quartz can only be created by the detonation of a nuclear weapon or a hypervelocity impact. Furthermore, the layer contains microtectites. These are tiny, glass-like spheres that formed when vaporized rock was blasted into the upper atmosphere, cooled in the vacuum of space, and rained back down onto the planet. Through geophysical mapping and gravity anomaly surveys, the crater was eventually located. Buried beneath the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico lies the Chicxulub crater, a scar over 150 kilometers wide. The asteroid that struck the Earth was approximately 10 to 12 kilometers in diameter, traveling at a speed of over 20 kilometers per second. When it hit, the energy released was equivalent to billions of atomic bombs. The impact vaporized the shallow ocean and the carbonate-rich rock of the Yucatan instantly. It threw a colossal volume of vaporized rock, sulfur, and soot into the stratosphere. A tsunami hundreds of meters high surged outward, scouring the coastlines of the Americas. But the initial explosion and the tsunamis only killed the animals in the immediate hemisphere. The true global extinction was caused by what happened next. The soot and dust ejected into the upper atmosphere spread rapidly, wrapping the entire planet in a dense, dark shroud. The sunlight was blocked. The Earth plunged into a deep, freezing impact winter. We can read the severity of this winter not just from the iridium, but from the microscopic spores trapped in the rock directly above it. In the lab, paleontologists prepare glass slides of ancient pollen, a field called palynology. They analyze samples extracted from the layers immediately succeeding the impact. Below the boundary, the slides show a diverse mix of pollen from flowering plants, conifers, and cycads. But directly above the iridium line, that diversity is replaced by a massive, overwhelming concentration of fern spores. This fern spike is the direct signature of a devastated landscape. Ferns are pioneer plants. They are often the first organisms to colonize a completely burned or sterilized environment. Because they can grow in low light and poor soil. The global fern spike proves that the impact winter caused a near-total collapse of the planet's forests. Without sunlight, photosynthesis stopped. The vast coastal forests and inland plains withered and died. This was the ultimate constraint of the dinosaurian architecture. The very traits that had allowed them to dominate the Mesozoic, their massive size and their high speed. Endothermic metabolisms, now became their death sentence. A triceratops required hundreds of pounds of fresh vegetation a day just to maintain its body heat and move its massive bulk. A Tyrannosaurus rex required a steady supply of large, meat-bearing prey. When the plants died, the massive herbivores starved. When the herbivores died, the apex predators followed shortly after. The food web collapsed from the bottom up. The planetary machine had turned against them. The size and specialization that had made them the undisputed rulers of the Earth offered no defense against starvation in the dark. The era of the giants was over, but the dinosaur lineage was not entirely extinguished. A small, specialized branch of their family tree had already developed the tools necessary to survive the apocalypse. They were about to inherit a broken world. We stand before a glass display case in a museum. Inside, a modern bird skeleton is mounted next to the cast of a small, feathered Cretaceous theropod. At first glance, the differences seem obvious. One has a beak and no teeth. The other has a jaw full of sharp serrations. One has a fused, stubby tail. The other has a long, bony whip. But if we look past the superficial changes and focus on the fundamental skeletal architecture, the continuity is undeniable. They share the same three-toed foot. They share the same S-shaped neck. They share the same wishbone. And the same hollow, pneumatized bones that once housed a highly efficient, unidirectional respiratory system. The bird is not simply a relative of the dinosaurs. It is a dinosaur. When the Chicxulub asteroid plunged the Earth into an impact winter, it was an indiscriminate killer. It wiped out the giant theropods, the massive ceratopsians, the long-necked sauropods, and the heavily armored ankylosaurs. It also wiped out the flying pterosaurs and the giant marine reptiles that ruled the oceans. Over 75% of all species on Earth went extinct. So why did the avian dinosaurs, the birds, survive? The answer lies in the specific constraints of their biology. We cannot reconstruct the exact, day-to-day survival of these ancient birds. The fossil record immediately following the KPG boundary is notoriously sparse, leaving us without the direct evidence needed to watch them adapt in real time. But by analyzing the traits of the lineages that made it through the bottleneck, we can infer their survival strategy. It was a strict combination of size, diet, and mobility. The avian dinosaurs that survived the extinction were very small. They were likely no larger than a modern quail or duck. Their small size meant their absolute caloric requirements were a fraction of those of a triceratops, or even a microraptor, in a world where the forests had burned and photosynthesis had halted. Large bodies were a fatal liability. Small bodies were a crucial advantage. Furthermore, the shape of their skulls tells us about their diet. The lineages of toothed birds, which likely relied on insects or small prey, largely went extinct alongside the other dinosaurs. The survivors were predominantly those that had evolved keratinous beaks adapted for a very specific food source, seeds. While the leaves and stems of plants died in the darkness of the impact winter, the ground was littered with millions of seeds. These seeds acted as tiny, durable nutrient capsules, capable of lying dormant in the soil for years. The surviving avian dinosaurs effectively ate their way through the apocalypse. They cracked open the seed bank of a dead forest. Their final advantage was the very mechanism that had defined their lineage since the late Jurassic, flight. The ability to fly allowed these small, feathered dinosaurs to cover vast distances. They could escape the most severely devastated zones to find isolated pockets of resources, or migrate to regions where the climatic effects of the impact were slightly less severe. Flight gave them the ultimate mobility in a fractured, dying world. They were not the only survivors. Small, burrowing mammals, which could hide from the temperature swings and feed on insects and roots,